Dr. Maranci will discuss the significant impact of the 7th century patriarchal cathedral of Zvartnots, the architecture, its design, as it influenced our own parish of St. John's here. Our parish, as well as Zvartnots itself, throughout history has been considered one of the jewels of Armenian ecclesiastical buildings. We have been blessed to continue that design here today. Dr. Maranci received her PhD in 1998 from Princeton University in the Department of Art and Archaeology. Her first book, Medieval Armenian Architecture, Constructions of Race and Nation, was published in the year 2001. Articles on Armenian art have appeared in the Revue des Études Arméniennes, a French journal on Armenian art studies, as well as in the UCLA Armenian History and Culture series, and many other periodicals. She has taught Armenian art at the University of Michigan, the University of Chicago, and my own alma mater, where I received my art history degree as well, the University of Wisconsin. And in fact, it was one day accidentally, I won't burden you with the circumstances, but I was calling the office to inquire about something, and she picked up the phone. And I said, "Who is this?" And she said, "This is Chistina Maranci." And I'm thinking, some Italian. No. And I had this conversation with her, not knowing that she had just started working on the staff at the university. And it was my pleasure to know that actually, where I had studied Armenian art, history, where there were no Armenian art teachers on staff, finally, the University of Wisconsin came into its own and was smart enough to hire one. That was in the 1990s. Since then, we've kind of watched each other's journeys in locations, and it was about a year ago or so that by invitation of Father Hurach, we all know Father Hurach Sarkisian, our former intern, I was invited to attend a program and conference at St. Gregory of Nadeg Armenian Church on Armenian architecture. Lo and behold, who was the speaker? My dear friend, Dr. Chistina Maranci. So Yereskin and I got in the car, we drove 3 hours. I said, "I'm not going to miss this one, she's too close for comfort." And we enjoyed an evening of reuniting and hearing a little bit about what she's going to talk about tonight that she presented that evening. And so I asked her, this is how I plan things a year in advance, "Would you come to Detroit if I..." And she said, "Would I come to Detroit? Of course I would." Well, that was the history of last year, and here we are this evening. So without any further ado, it is my greatest pleasure to invite to the podium our dear lecturer and a colleague of mine, Dr. Chistina Maranci.
Thank you so much, Father Garabed. Thank you so much for the invitation in the first place. It was a delight to see you last year, and the way we met each other initially was so strange and wonderful, and here we are today. So I'm delighted and very grateful for the invitation and for this chance to talk to all of you about your church and about the ancient sources for your church as I have studied them. So I do know your church. I think I visited when I was a little girl. That was my first visit. Well, not sort of little. I was born in '68, so the church was 2 years old approximately when, but I was a little older when I visited. But I do remember it, and I visited since many times because I have family in the area. And I've always been very impressed by the building, but I was never given the opportunity to speak here about the church. And so again, I thank Father Garabed for that. So I teach medieval Armenian art at Tufts, and that's the focus of my research. So when I see an Armenian church, can you all hear me pretty well? When I see an Armenian church, a new Armenian church, relatively new. I always think about what the ancient sources are, because when the church is purpose-built for an Armenian congregation, very often it cites or appropriates or somehow borrows some traditional church architecture features. And that is nowhere more true than in the case of St. John's. The fusion of Armenian architectural traditions here is very potent and powerful, and so I'm again glad to be able to speak about what I see. So understand that I am not a specialist on St. John's or Suren Pilafian, and he deserves his own monograph, I'm sure, but I am a specialist on, again, the ancient sources for this, for the church. So that's what I want to give you some perspective on today. So what I'm going to sort of argue today, or try to convince you of, is that St. John's represents a fusion of traditions. It's not a copy of Zvartnots, it's not simply a copy, but it brings together a fusion of different Armenian sacred traditions, different monuments into a single building. I'm going to be looking at the outside of the building and its general shape, its round shape, and then we're going to go inside the church and talk about the arches, and then finally talk a little bit about the pictorial images. Know Zvartnots, right? From the ancient ruins that you see every time you go to Echmiadzin from Yerevan, you pass by the ancient site of Zvartnots, which you see below. And then you have Toramanyan's reconstruction of Zvartnots on the upper right and the plan of Zvartnots on the left. And Zvartnots is important because it is the first dated Armenian round church that we know. So it forms an important source for St. John's in that basic round shape. But one thing that scholars have argued about and published a lot about is where Zvartnots comes from. So if we know where St. John's comes from in terms of its general configuration, where does Zvartnots come from? What are its sources? And that's something that I have been very interested in, and I've been reading about and thinking about now for many years. And that's what I want to sort of focus on today. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that if St. John's is a fusion of architectural traditions, Zvartnots is also a fusion of architectural traditions. It is a building that, as Father Garabed mentioned, was a patriarchal cathedral built by the Patriarch Nerses in the middle of the 7th century, Nerses III, Shinoch. And it, as much as I can tell, wasn't a copy of any one particular building. He didn't decide, I want that, so I'm going to build it in Armenia. But he fused together this series of sacred buildings to build something that was, at Zvartnots, entirely new and creative. So that's going to be what I talk about. And I'm going to take you to a number of different places tonight as I explain this. First, we're going to look specifically at Armenian holy traditions, because as much as Zvartnots borrows from monuments outside of Armenia, it was ultimately an Armenian sacred site that was firmly entrenched within the tradition of the conversion of Armenia to Christianity. So we're going to go to the site, talk about Zvartnots in relation to Armenian holy tradition. We're also going to look at Zvartnots as very much a product of 7th century Armenian architecture. And finally, we're going to talk about Zvartnots in the context of Armenia in relation to its natural landscape. Because often when we study architectural history, we forget that these buildings live in a natural landscape, whether that's in the mountains or a plateau or near a river. It's easy to forget that, particularly when we don't live in Armenia and we don't study these buildings on site as much as we would like to. We study by means of plans and photographs, and we forget that their meaning, as they were originally planned and sited and built, was in relation to natural features. And this is very true in the case of Zvartnots. So we must understand Zvartnots, first of all, in a local context, to do with holy tradition, building tradition, and the natural landscape. And then The other three things I want to do is take you outside of Armenia. We're going to go to other holy centers, the imperial capital of Byzantium, Constantinople, the site of major churches that Nerses, the patron of Zvartnots, probably knew. Then we go to Syria and talk about some holy churches there that may have formed the sources for Zvartnots. And then finally to Jerusalem, which I think where we find, to my mind, the most compelling evidence for the inspiration of Zvartnots and ultimately then St. John's as well. As I already said, Zvartnots is close to Echmiadzin. Here's a map, and I think I can use my cursor just to show you. Here's Zvartnots, okay, there it is, and then Echmiadzin right here. And so Zvartnots, when Nerses, the patriarch, planned and built the church, he built it in direct relationship to already existing holy sites in Armenia. Echmiadzin being, of course, the ground zero, if you like, of the Armenian sacred landscape. This is where Christ came down with the golden hammer and flattened the plateau. And this was where Hripsime and Gaiane were martyred, and their tombs were. This is where the Cathedral of Echmiadzin is. So this was, even before Zvartnots was built, when there was nothing at that site, this area was already a holy area. So Nerses, in building Zvartnots, was making a direct connection, a direct relation to these holy sites, and he was doing this not only by building close to Echmiadzin, but also by the dedication of Zvartnots itself, because Zvartnots means the vigilant ones, and this is a quotation or a deliberate kind of pointing to a line from the story of the conversion of the Armenians by Agathongelos, which talks about the Zvartnots and the vigilant ones, these angelic powers. And so Nerses, again, he is connecting with the conversion tradition not only by building close to Echmiadzin, but by this dedication. Okay, so already Nerses is setting up here a holy site by location and by the name of the church. Okay, so here you have the site itself, and as you know, it no longer survives because it collapsed in an earthquake, unfortunately, in probably the late 10th, early 11th century. So we no longer have it as it once was, and in fact, it has been increasingly rebuilt over the past decades. So if you look at older photographs from the 1980s, you'll see much more of just a platform, and now it's starting to be reconstructed slowly. But I wanted you to look at this and tell me what else you see besides the building. You see Ararat. Okay. Now, again, this is where we as architectural historians often forget what we're looking at, because we're so focused on the buildings and so focused on the stone, and we think, oh, it's just a tourist photograph, you know. I mean, everybody takes a picture of Zvartnots with Mount Ararat, but we forget the fact that what the tourists are responding to is probably not so different from what people in the 7th century responded to, and that is that power, the relationship between the church and the mountain. Now, remember that Zvartnots once was standing, so it was once a building of tiers, of levels, probably with a conical roof, although there's some debate about that. But in any event, a building of diminishing tiers, not unlike a mountain, so that when you looked at Zvartnots, in this case, you're looking at it from the north, due north, you're looking right through, and this is the main road. If you've been there, you know this is the main road. This is the north portal. You are right on axis with Mount Ararat. It really couldn't be a better site. And I've looked at this from satellite maps, and I'm amazed at how perfectly it lines up. So I don't think this is an accident. I don't think it's just tourists being tourists. I think what we're looking at here is a very deliberate siting of the monument in relation to Ararat. Now, that isn't just an aesthetic choice, because Ararat wasn't just a mountain to Armenians. It isn't just a mountain to Armenians. In the conversion legend, it has a particular meaning. It's the place where Terdat went after he converted to Christianity to quarry stone for the first Christian buildings. So he went up there himself, according to the 5th century legend of Agatangalos, and he went up to Ararat, and with his own hands, his own arms, he quarried the stone and brought it all back down the mountain. Now, however we want to argue about that, whether we think that's historically true or not, that's not my focus here. My focus is on the fact that this monument, this mountain, was a sacred mountain in the context of the conversion tradition. So it itself was sacred. And what Nerses did by lining up the church with the mountain was make that relationship visual. So that's very interesting. It suggests that he is trying, not just trying to kind of make Zvartnots a local shrine in terms of its proximity to Echmiadzin or its name, but also this relationship to a sacred conversion landscape. So it's something we have to remember, again, as architectural historians, that there is this natural world that does exist. As dirty as it may be, it exists, and we need to talk about it because the buildings are related to it. They live in this landscape, which was, whether we're talking about the plateau that's flattened by the hammer of God or the mountain that's quarried by Terdat, this living landscape was sacred to the Armenians, and is. But Nerses also built the monument using a set of local techniques and materials. So when we look at Zvartnots, and I'm showing you here a range of 7th century Armenian church plans, we can see Zvartnots. You can pick it out right here. Okay, can you see with my pointer? It can be understood as part of a real architectural revolution in Armenia that happened in the 7th century. And this is something that I've just finished a book about because it's a very important moment in architectural history that hasn't been well studied in Anglophone contexts, in English writing contexts. It's very understudied, as Father Garabed knows. But what's so striking about the 7th century is, for Armenia and for building in the Christian East, is that all of a sudden, at a time of tremendous conflict, Byzantines are fighting with Persians, and ultimately Byzantines are fighting with Arabs, to lead to a dramatic transformation of the worldscape with the coming of the Islamic world. During this time, this cataclysmic time, Armenians are building scores of buildings. And not only building scores of buildings, but building with tremendous diversity of plan. Just look at these plans. Each one is different from the other. And they're only representative of even more buildings. So there is rightfully a golden age, that's what it's been called, a golden age of Armenian architecture in the 7th century. And that's why this happens, what are the ramifications, how it influences later Armenian architecture and other architectures remains an interesting horizon for study. But what the point I want to make here is that Zvartnots may be understood within this golden age. It is a building that is geometric in form, and I'll just ask you to look around and you can see the strong geometry of these forms. It is domed, and that's again something typical of these 7th century monuments. Not only do you get an explosion of building in the 7th century in Armenia, but you get the beginning of domed, vaulted architecture developed in all kinds of sophisticated ways. One good example that you will know is the Church of Hripsime in Echmiadzin, which is built approximately 30 years before Zvartnots, founded by the Patriarch Gomidas in its 7th century manifestation, built over the tomb of the martyr Hripsime. And here you have a sense of that geometric exterior and the strong use of, I always think of the word geometry. There are cones, there are cylinders, there are cubes, there are triangles. It's a very, very pronounced exterior expression of this building. In some ways, Zvartnots can be tied to this. The other important point to make is that Zvartnots is also built like local Armenian tradition. It's built using rubble core masonry. So very, very smooth, polished facing stones that sandwich a core of mortar and fieldstone, so that it's very technique is perfectly to be understood within the Armenian tradition. Even scholars have noticed mason's marks that are used, and mason's marks are these small marks on stones. Whether they were autographs of the mason, we don't know, but they're used on 7th century monuments, and you can actually track the same marks on different monuments, whether it's Hripsime or Zvartnots or other monuments. So again, Zvartnots can be located within Armenian architectural tradition and within Armenian sacred tradition very well. Just another shot of Hripsime to again emphasize that exteriority, and then the plan of Hripsime. And in a way, I'm showing you this monument because it is so well preserved, whereas Zvartnots is not. So when you look into the interior of Hripsime, you have a sense of the form, of the organization of space. And here you're looking at an interior view in the area of under the dome, into the area of the sanctuary niche, which is right here, and then into these side areas here that lead into the corner chambers. But if we go back to the plan, you can see this building is so refined in its conception. It naturally sort of you're naturally led from one part to the next, and the undulation of the inside. Just to be a kind of architectural geek for a minute, in the inside it's very undulating. And on the outside, it's very sort of strongly geometric and almost crystalline. So it's aesthetically a very refined monument. And one thing that's always confused architectural people who work on early Christian architecture is where this refinement, where this sophistication comes from, because it's very difficult to trace the preparatory steps for it. But it certainly exists in Armenia. So here again, the interior view, and then the dome. And so the dome should also remind you of the dome at St. John's. Again, we don't have the dome at Zvartnots anymore, but we have Hripsime's dome, and maybe you can see the use of those lappets that radiate out from the central boss, or the central hole here, in this case from the chandelier suspends from it. But you can see how this really creates a kind of focal point for the whole building. That you have this center, and from it radiates out these sort of lappets or tongue-like forms, and then the windows, and then the whole building develops out from there. So Zvartnots, as I tried to argue, can be understood within this Armenian sacred tradition. But in a lot of ways, it was a new building. And it did some new things that we don't see before in Hripsime or Gaiane or any of the earlier Armenian churches. And so I thought we would just play a little game here, and I'll ask you, what do you see? Maybe if you don't have any ideas, that's fine, I'll just keep talking. But if you do you see anything different at Zvartnots that you don't see at Hripsime? So they're both domed, they're both sort of geometric in their forms, but is there something new that strikes you in Zvartnots on the left?
The circles.
Circles? Yeah, so there's the use of circles, and maybe I'm just going to bring my cursor over here. So you have the outer circle, and then you have also the inner areas too, these curvatures, and these curvatures here. That's a very interesting feature, and I want to maybe elaborate a little bit on that, because it isn't something we see generally in Armenian architecture of the period. What we usually see are domes. Sometimes they're supported on piers, or they're supported on the perimeter wall of the building, so that the perimeter wall just holds the dome up. But it's rare to have a situation or it's not known ever to have a situation like this in 7th century Armenia, where you have these circular forms that create actually two interiors. There's a middle, central area, right, that's under the dome, and then outside of it, there's this. So I'm just going to explain this, and I'm just going to raise my voice for a minute. If you can't hear me, just let me know, but I wanted to explain this because it's important. So if you've been to Zvartnots, you know how this feels as a space, but if you haven't, you won't know. This is the central domed area, and then this part here, you see where these dots are. These are columns. They're now, they're just mostly just columns, but you can walk through here. This is basically just columns that you can walk through. So this is what you might call a kind of screen of columns, and you can see, if you're standing here, you can see out here, but it's partially blocked. And so you have three of these columns. We call them exedrae in architectural language. That's the term we use. So they're called columnar exedrae. Now, there are two things interesting about this that make it an innovation in an Armenian context. One is the use of columns. We don't generally see columns used in Armenian architecture. We see piers. And the difference is that columns are cylinders, and piers are either square or rectangular or some other kind of form. Columns are something you see, for example, in Greek temple architecture, but they're not common to early Christian Armenia. Unless we're talking about Garni, but that's not Christian, so it doesn't matter. And the other thing that's strange is the idea of these columnar spaces where we have a kind of screen, as I mentioned, these exedrae, as they're called, curved columnar spaces. That does not happen in Armenian architecture of this era. So both of those make this space new in an Armenian context. And we have to ask, well, why? Why does Nerses introduce this? What is this new space doing? Why would you want it? And so that's what I want to kind of talk about a little bit. So here you just have another view of Zvartnots, again with a view to, I think that's from the west. So you're looking into one of those exedrae spaces. You see that? So you see that curved columnar space right over here. Okay, and it really does change the way you experience the building. Even though it doesn't survive in its totality, we can get a sense of it, the way it must have felt, which is a very graceful thing, to stand in this space and feel like these columns are kind of moving away from you and then coming towards you, and you can think about it as a kind of architecture with movement. But what are the sources for this columnar exedrae form? Where does it come from? There have been different suggestions, but one suggestion is that it's coming from a very important building in its own right and a good 100 years before Zvartnots, and that is the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, dated to around 537, under the Emperor Justinian, one of the, of course, great Byzantine emperor and sort of mastermind of the Byzantine Empire to its greatest extent, and patron of this church. Oh, did you have a question?
Well, they hired outsource architect, Greek guy maybe.
Oh, you mean for Zvartnots?
Right.
Yeah, it's possible. These are speculations that can certainly be entertained. Maybe we can discuss that more afterwards. I'd definitely like to explore that. What's certainly, I think, immediately noticeable is that we see this same form used, and and I'm just going to point to it for everyone else. You can find these exedrae. You follow where my arrow is. You find these exedrae here, and then here. And I think I have actually a few slides of Hagia Sophia so you can see what this looks like. So this is just an exterior view of Hagia Sophia. Here's an interior view of Hagia Sophia. And then here's an exedra. So you can see here what this space feels like. And it's very interesting, it's a wonderful thing because you feel like you're sort of being embraced by this architecture. And we know that Nerses went to Constantinople. We know he was very familiar with Greek culture. So it's possible that even if any building was going to make an impression on someone, and those of you who know Hagia Sophia, I mean, it will make an impression on you. It's a staggering building. So it's possible that Zvartnots was not only drawing from Armenian tradition, but also from Byzantine tradition from the 6th century. And again, just another view, just to think about this curved space at Zvartnots and then going back to Hagia Sophia. Okay. Okay, now, in the 1970s, a very smart architectural historian named Eugene Kleinbauer, I hope he's not here tonight, no, I'm just kidding, did some wonderful work on Zvartnots in relation to a series of holy buildings, Christian buildings in Syria and Mesopotamia. And I'm putting Zvartnots here in the center, and I'm putting those buildings in Syria and Mesopotamia on each of the corners. They date to the mostly 6th century, 5th, 6th century. And you may not know them, they're not famous like the Hagia Sophia, but they are nonetheless, important monuments, major monuments in the context of the Christian East. Rasafa in Syria was situated within an important pilgrimage city. Apamea, also very important near Rasafa. And then the two others as well, also in Syria. And the one above, Seleucia Pieria, was actually near Antioch and had mosaic. And you can see some of the decoration of the mosaic maybe indicated in this floor plan. But what I want you to notice about all of these churches, they're different, right? They look different, but they all share these exedra forms. You see that? You're probably now kind of noticing those exedra forms. And so Kleinbauer, this architectural historian, he called this form the domed tetraconch. It was a dome. That's how he grouped these buildings. They were domed tetraconchs, or four-conched buildings, and they had domes on them. And so he said they were all related. They were all part of a family of building in Syria and Mesopotamia and Armenia, and he really saw them as part of a group. So he understood Zvartnots not so much in relation to Armenian tradition or the Hagia Sophia, but he saw it in relation to this group of Syrian and Mesopotamian monuments. And it's certainly a really interesting thesis. He's one of the few architectural historians to branch out into Armenian architecture at a fairly early date, mid-20th century. He was doing that. So this was important, arguably groundbreaking work that he did. It's something I've also studied very much because I want to know more about Zvartnots. So of course I read his work very carefully. One of the things I found was that there have been ongoing excavations of these different sites and ongoing historical work. Of course, whenever you study a building, an ancient building, you never know what's going to turn up. So you can write about it, but maybe 50 years later, they're going to find something else. So I've been studying and reading the archaeology on these buildings and learning about them. And there are some issues that arise with Kleinbauer's thesis, but I don't want to talk about them. What I want to focus on is one key difference that he downplays between Zvartnots and the other buildings. And I'm looking at the screen myself to see if you can find it, but this might be one of these times when I ask a question and it's too vague and nobody knows what I'm asking, which happens a lot in class. But I'm going to try to ask this the right way. Because I have the answer in the next slide, but I want to see if I can get you there. So I want you to look. You see, you have these conches, these exedra, and then you have the spaces between them, like these corner areas. Okay, and then I want you to look at the way this Zvartnots is different in these corner areas than any of the others. There's something that Zvartnots has that the others don't have or aren't really doing. Is that too vague? Might be too vague. Yes. Okay, yes. Complete circle. Thank you very much. So.